Hey, welcome back to the Metropole Grid. My name is Andre. Thanks so much for dropping by. So it's been 8 months in the coming, and we finally have an updated NAPD Most Wanted list. This updated list just came out exactly a week ago on April 12th. It was a Wednesday, and it is effective immediately, which means that this Most Wanted list just it paves out the new world of Netrunner that we are currently running in, which is actually pretty exciting. I'm pretty optimistic about this list, and I wanted to take some time just to talk a bit about this list. For those who are newer to Netrunner, kind of explain what this means, because this is a big deal, and talk a bit about the changes on this list, what came on, what came off, and perhaps why that is, and talk a bit about what changes I believe and what impact I believe this will have on the competitive Netrunner meta. Apologies, we haven't had a video on this channel for a bit. I was away this weekend, but it was a long weekend here in Canada. But I'm back, so without further ado, let's have at it. So this is the NAPD Most Wanted list, and this is how FFG Organized Play has been balancing Netrunner, at least for the last, I think it's a bit more than a year now, we've had the Most Wanted list. And the idea with the Most Wanted list is that they single out specific cards that they believe are either too good, too undercosted, too abusable, and they make them harder to put into your deck, into decks in general. And how they do that, they don't restrict cards, they don't flat out restrict cards, they don't have some sort of like weird, well, not weird, but they don't have like rarity where you can only have like a certain number of legendary cards in your deck. All they do is they mess with the influence that these cards cost. They change those numbers. Classically, oh no, I guess we'll not start there. So this is what they did, excuse me. These cards now cost 1 extra influence. There's 2 tiers to the NAPD Most Wanted list, and this is the first tier. They call it level 1, and all these cards cost +1 universal influence to add to your deck. Now, universal influence isn't a term that's come up in the rulebook before. This is entirely brand new. And it's actually pretty simple to understand. The idea is that all of these cards, they're not marked in any specific way on the card, mind you. You have to understand, you'll learn this by watching this video or going on to FFG's website, is all these cards now cost you an extra influence to put in your deck. And the reason why this is universal influence is this is regardless of what faction you're playing. Normally, if you put a Shaper card in a Shaper deck, it doesn't cost influence. But now, with universal influence, that changes. So let's look here at our first card. This is Cerberus Lady H1, a super good Fractor that was added to the Most Wanted list, I think 1 or 2 iterations ago. And it's now... well, now it costs +1 universal influence. And what that means is if you want to bring Lady, which is already 3 influence, outside of Shaper, you're going to have to play 3 influence +1 universal influence. So it'll cost 4 influence to put it in your criminal deck. But if you want to put Lady inside your Shaper deck, you don't have to pay these 3 influence because it's in faction, but you do have to play 1 universal influence. Sorry if I botched that the slightest bit, but the idea is that all these cards will cost 1 influence extra regardless of what faction you play them in. And that's actually a pretty big deal. That's something we haven't seen so far in Netrunner. Now the interesting thing about this Most Wanted list is there actually are 2 tiers, and there's a second tier that goes all the way from level 1 straight to level 3, skipping level 2, and these cards, not as many of them, but these cards cost +3 universal influence. So now if you want to put Blackmail in your deck or DDoS in your deck, this is going to cost +3 influence regardless of what you're playing, and that's a really big deal. These cards are kind of nuts, so I'm glad they're there. But that's the idea. Quick difference, if you're used to the old Most Wanted list, this is actually pretty different than, well, not entirely, but like somewhat different than how it used to be. The old Most Wanted list, what they would said is if you wanted to put any of the cards on the Most Wanted list in your deck, they didn't cost universal influence, but they actually just reduced the maximum influence your identity had. So if you want to put clone chips in your Kate deck, every clone chip would reduce the amount of influence Kate could work with. So if you put 3 clone chips with, Kate would only have 12 influence. And that's only subtly different because of something called the Professor rule, from my understanding. This is Professor, a Shaper that is from Creation and Control. He's a lot of fun to play, not very reliable, but he only has 1 influence. And the idea with Professor is the old way that these cards used to be worded is that there was no way to decrease your influence below 1. It was something called the Professor rule in the old NAPD Most Wanted list, and the idea was if you put cards from the Most Wanted list in your deck, it would reduce your influence, but you could never go below 1. So in theory, the Professor could run 3 clone chips and it wouldn't be a problem, even though each clone chip would reduce his influence by 1. That's totally different now. Now with the universal influence, if you add a clone chip, it's going to cost one influence, so the professor can only run one clone chip. So what was used to be known as the professor rule exists no more. And why that might not be too important, considering the professor hasn't been really a tournament viable ID, at least classically. I know some people have had success with it, but it's more of a reason because if you notice, I think there's what, like 11 or 12 cards on the most wanted list, runner cards at least, and I think 8 of them are Anarch. So it's actually quite possible, and people were worried when the new most wanted list would come out that you could just take all the strongest, the most wanted Anarch cards and put them all in one deck, and you would have 0 influence because you would reduce your maximum down to 0, but you'd still have like a reasonably good deck. And that's not longer possible. It's no longer possible because of this professor rule no longer existing. So if you want to put all these cards in your deck, you're actually going to run out of influence, and that's a really big deal, so be mindful of that. But that's it. That's an NAPD most wanted list. These cards cost influence. And that's really important when you're deck building. I think it's important just to take a little stop here to say that this is FFGOP's rules. This is organized play's rules. So if you're ever going to play, if you're newer to Netrunner, if you're going to play in an organized event that is from like a game night kit, a store championship, national, regional, anything above that, you're going to have to be holding to these rules. These are just the rules of Netrunner currently, competitive Netrunner. So that's good. Just kind of, you got to get used to that because this doesn't say it anywhere on your data packs or on your boxes or anything. You just kind of have to understand that by going on the internet, which I don't think is too bad. It's not that hard to find this information. But now there's this like this kind of gray area. You might be thinking, like, if I'm playing casually, if I'm meeting up with my friends, do I stick to the most wanted list? Do I not? From my experience in Montreal, where I am, just about everyone who plays casually at meetups, even if they're not playing tournament level decks, they do stick to the most wanted list. If you don't want to do that, it shouldn't be a problem. I think it's probably in good form just to tell your opponent, hey, I'm not playing a most wanted list deck. Is that problem? And if you're a newer player, generally nobody really minds. And even then, if you're not a newer player, maybe people don't mind. I don't think it's that big of a deal either way. Communication is always good. Again, if you're playing like just at home, playing on your kitchen or your dining room table, what have you, who cares? This stuff doesn't actually matter to you. You can enjoy Netrunner however you want to. Just, you have to understand, if you're playing at tournament levels, this is balancing around the tournament gameplay. So be mindful of that. So yeah, let's just dive into it to talk a bit about these cards. There's a lot of cards that haven't changed. They were on the most wanted list before, and they were on the iteration before that, and I'm not going to talk too much about them. A lot of them, like most of these cards here, the 7 of these 8 were on the most wanted list before, and they're on here just because they're too good for as easy as they are to splash into a deck, or they're just kind of, problems come up in design. Like Parasite is a bit too easy to recur. Clone Chip is a bit too powerful at only 2 influence and 1 credit. Yogg is kind of too good at 1 influence. Stuff like that. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about those, so I'm just going to talk mostly about the differences and what's changed. And the first change here is Temujin Contract. And Temujin Contract, I guess we should pull it up, huh? Temujin Contract is a really, really good card. This came out at the beginning of, I hope I don't have to use the umlaut. Nice. Temujin Contract came out at the beginning of Flashpoint Cycle, and it was a really, really big, it caused a really, really big shift in the meta. So this is one of the most credits on a single card on the runner side in Netrunner. Not including like limitless cards like Caddy, Joan, or Magnum Opus, but otherwise you put this down, you're going to get 16 credits worth of, well, credits. And that's really, really good for an econ card, let alone an econ card that's relatively easy to splash at 2 influence. Now, if you want to compare this card to things like Liberated Accounts, you'll notice Liberated Accounts also gives you basically a click for 4 credits. Spelling things is always going to be an issue, but the idea with Liberated Account singular is it's just half as effective as Temujin Contract. When you're using Liberated Account, you're not clicking to take the money off. Like with this card, you're clicking to take the money off. And with Temujin Contract, one of the reasons why it's so good is you're making runs and accessing cards when you're taking the money off, let alone it just does have 4 more credits on it, and it is cheaper to install. This card's really, really, really good. And people have complained that it's kind of too easy to include into your decks just because it's only 2 influence. I think it's fine to print criminal cards that are good at printing money because that's kind of the thing what they do. But once this shows up as a 2 of or a 3 of in most cases in almost all competitive decks since it's come out, that might be an issue that needs to be addressed. I do kind of like this deck or this card. Specifically, it made corps consider icing remotes that they wouldn't ice before. I think it also disincentivizes and it lets criminals, let alone anyone who's running this card, it lets them deal with horizontal decks. It gives you value off of uniced remotes and stuff like that. I think was really valuable to date, just because horizontal decks, what they're referred to generally as asset spam decks, were pretty prevalent. And I like the idea that this helped criminals keep up with them because they generally don't have the tools to do it. Now, if you want to put this in your deck, if you want to put 3 of in your criminal deck, and most criminal decks since the existence of this card have put 3, you have to pay 3 influence for them. So a lot of criminal IDs kind of just lost 3 influence. And that kind of seems rough, but it's not that bad because of Desperado, something we'll get to in a second. What I can see this doing is that this card, like with this being on the most wanted list, I think it doesn't impact criminals as much as it impacts the people who splashed this card. A lot of decks, a lot of like smoke decks, a lot of Anarch decks, good thing Anarch decks, maybe Wizard of Valencia, would run 3 of these just because they can make good use of them. And they would spend 6 influence on that, and now I'm pretty sure that they can actually just run 2 of these and spend the same amount of influence, just spend 6 on 2 of these, and then run, have an extra card slot in their deck. And I don't think that's too bad. One of the things that we'll be talking about more and more as we get to the later part of this, talking about this most wanted list, is I think the meta is actually going to slow down in a way, just because asset spam strategies don't seem as good as they used to be because of a card called Sensi's Actor Union now being 3 influence. Again, we'll talk about this in the future. So I'm pretty sure like Shaper decks and Anarch decks, or at least I'm speculating, that those might be able to get away with only running 2 of these. Like, I still think 3 influence for this card might be good enough if they're not running a different economy engine, something like Prepaid Voice Pad, another card we'll get to. That actually might be sweet, just because the big reason why Temujin was so good is that it was incredibly valuable or incredibly important to get this out early in the game, just because there were a lot of must-trash assets that you had to deal with on turn 1 in a lot of matchups, and this really helps you deal with that. I think with Sensi's Actor Union being on the most wanted list in the level 3, the game might slow down in a bit where you actually don't need to have that much burst money early on in the game, and I think that's probably good for runners and corps. So maybe actually having 2 of these and an extra deck slot in your deck might be good enough. We'll see. Other econ options might become more popular with things like Prepaid Voice Pad, but we'll get to that when we get to that. But I still think this card is going to see a bunch of play. Now, of course, if you're playing criminal, you have 3 less influence, but that kind of balances out because of another card called Desperado. So this is Desperado. It's a criminal console. It's a 1 of in the core set. So if you want all 3, you had to spend a lot of money on core sets. But this card is super, super, super good. Is I think the best criminal console and one of the best consoles in the game to date. Now, Desperado used to be on the most wanted list, and if we jump back here, you'll notice it isn't anymore. There's 3 cards that came off of the most wanted list, and Desperado is the first one that came off. Now, Desperado is really good. It's pretty cheap to install. It gives you a credit every time you run, which is a massive amount of money considering you can easily get this down turn 1, and you're a criminal, you're probably running a lot. A big reason why Desperado ended up on the most wanted list, from my understanding, not only is it very good, but because it kind of like boxed out all other consoles in criminal. And I didn't agree with that kind of mentality. Like, the idea was if Desperado was on the most wanted list and criminals, even criminals, had to pay 1 influence for it, it was supposed to encourage people running other criminal consoles, things like Boxy and Logos, and Gauntlet wasn't out at the time, but I don't know. When that happened, people still didn't play these cards. I don't think Boxy is going to win a lot of fights against Desperado. Desperado is just super, super good. So I like the idea that criminals aren't limited to playing influence for this just because their other consoles kind of suck. Yeah, and this balances out. Like, a lot of decks will run 3 Desperados, so the fact that Temujin, which is a very common 3 of in criminal decks, now, like, it just kind of balances out, and we're just where we were, basically, when Desperado was on the most wanted list, which is most criminals running with 12 influence. So, yeah, you get some, you lose some, that's not the expression, but we're basically back to page 1, which is okay. I really like the fact that Desperado is back because it was a very important tool against horizontal decks. The idea that you could run and basically every asset you trash was 1 cheaper made a huge deal, and it made deck building a bit more frustrating when you had to play influence for this. I guess we're still in the same spot with Temujin, but I like Desperado. Cool thing about Desperado not being on the most wanted list, it's now much easier to splash out of faction, and if you've never played an Anarch deck, something aggressive like a Reina Roja, or you even played like a Kate deck, there's a really cool Kate deck on the big boys website called Run the Net that involves like Desperado and Da Vinci and Patron, and just it's incredibly aggressive. It's super fun if you haven't tried Desperado out of faction, and I think splashing 2 Desperado out of faction isn't nuts, especially in some of the more fun decks. I don't know how competitive they are, but I'm glad that Desperado is free again. Talking about cards that came off the most wanted list, another one that I think is going to be really important, and this is the only other runner card that came off, is Prepaid Voice Pad. And this card is also pretty nuts. This seems pretty unassuming when you look at it. It's a neutral console. Nope. Hardware. It costs 2 to install. Motorcycle. It costs 2 to install. You have 1 recurring credit on it, and you can use this credit to play events. This card landed on the most wanted list for 2 reasons. Firstly, it actually greatly impinged the design space of events. And this is something Lucas Litzinger spoke about multiple times. He was the original designer of the reboot of Netrunner, and he made this card. The idea with Prepaid Voice Pad being accessible to all factions and to all runners became really hard to print more and more powerful events. The idea was that if you have 3 of these out, every event you play, or at least the first one you play per turn, costs 3 less. So the idea is that if you print a really cool event that costs like 6 to play, but it's very strong, at some point in the late game, it's kind of trivial to play, and it just makes it very hard to print interesting or very strong events. And that's something Lucas was but he was vocal about it. So this coming off the most wanted list is going to be interesting. And I think we're just going to have to pay attention now to events when they do come out to realize how they work with Prepaid Voice Pad. Because there's potential to make some things that are kind of, in some way or other, just way too efficient. And yes, you do have to set up the prepaid voice pads. And yes, you do have to get good draw and all that sort of stuff. But it's honestly not that bad. And the big reason why it's not too bad, and the big reason why Prepaid Voice Pad landed on the most wanted list, if I didn't mention it just came off, was because of something called Prepaid Kate. This is a Prepaid Kate deck list. This is actually, this deck list won Gen Con North American Nationals in 2014 by Montreal's own Benoit Gascon. Benoit has been part of this channel ever since the beginning. He's done a lot of commentary if you want to check older videos. Also, if you want to check him playing the game out, Team Covenant has some good videos on their channel. Now, Prepaid Kate was a huge deal. This was like the de facto standard competitive runner for a long time. It was a lot of HB versus Kate for a really long while. And the idea is Kate's ability lets you install a hardware or program each turn, reducing its cost by 1. So your prepaid voice pad costs 1 credit. So you're paying 1 credit to get 1 recurring credit, which you can use that turn alone. And this engine gets, it's not like really obvious how good this is. It might not be, but it's absurd. The idea is you run a lot of events. You run things like Maker's Eye, which becomes free at some point. Test Run. Not entirely sure why we run Test Run. I think it's because Femme Fatale. That one threw me for a loop when I looked at the deck at first. Sure, Gamble becomes super good. Like at some point, it's Click for 7 credits. Benoit's special. He ran Special Order, but people made fun of him for that. Paid off. Lucky Find gets nuts. You're now spending 2 clicks for up to like 9 credits. Levy gets really easy to use. Legwork gets good. Dirty Laundry becomes super good. It's like 5 credits, make a run. And this becomes awesome. And one of the biggest things about these prepaid decks is at one point you have all your programs, all your hardware on the table, you have all your prepaid voice pads, and then you pay your 2 credits to levy. And then your deck, once you shuffle it back in, is all draw cards and all money cards. And at that point, things get absurd and multi-access. And that was really the strength of Prepaid Kate. It was just like really strong economy, the ability to bounce back from 0 credits with your prepaid. Like you can play Dirty Laundry from 0, go up to 5. Next turn, play Lucky Find, go up to 14 or whatever. I didn't know, that's not right, but something like that. No, maybe that is right. It was really good. And it was too good. And that's why this thing ended up on the most wanted list, this prepaid voice pad. And now it's back. Which in some ways is pretty intimidating because these prepaid Kate decks were pretty good and now they might be back. And that's exciting to a lot of people in my meta. I know Montreal was classically the Shaper town, and I know so many people here that just like are tried and true Shaper players, and they're really excited to have this roll out. It's also really cool to know that prepaid voice pad, as cool as it is in Kate and as efficient as it is in Kate, you can use this into basically any identity, and you can get pretty good value in just about any faction. I think it's also important to look at all the cards that came out, all the events that came out since Prepaid Voice Pad was on the most wanted list. This is just the last 3 cycles, just to go over them really quickly. I don't know how meaningful these cards are so far, not so good. This is a big one, actually. Deuces Wild is a really big addition to the Prepaid Voice Pad economy. I think Prepaid Voice Pads will probably be playing this. This is Dan D'Argenio's first World's winning championship card. And the idea is eventually you pay nothing for this card and you can gain 3 credits and draw 2 cards. That's crazy. That's really good efficiency. Unfortunately, the remove 1 tag clause on this card, which used to be one of the sweetest parts of it, is no longer that good considering the existence of Aaron Moran, but I still think this card is worth 1 influence in a deck that runs prepaid voice pat. It gives you a lot of flexibility and you play it for free, which is great. Moving on to this cycle, pushing the envelope still isn't good. Spot the Prey. Mad Dash, no, nothing just yet. And 1 cycle before it, there's actually not that much meaningful in here for prepaid voice pad. So I don't think that many new stuff came out. You might actually want to look 1 cycle before this, but Freedom Through Equality, I guess you have Mad Dash now, but it's cool to pay nothing for that. Out of the Ashes, maybe you can pay for nothing, but I probably just want to throw that out. High Stakes Job is good, and I think Run Amok is actually pretty great with prepaid voice pad. This is actually one of the decks that I think is going to be very popular is Anarch prepaid voice pad decks. If you get these down with Anarch, which is a bit more expensive, there's a lot of really good Anarch events that cost 1 to 2 credits. You have things like all your draw options cost money. Playing Inject for free and or making money with it's good. Same with I've Had Worse, playing that for free, making it a diesel is pretty great. But you also have a lot of destructive, really aggressive destructive run events. Run Amok, playing that for 1 credit makes it actually like really good just to spam out at any point in time in the game. Being able to play your Forked, Knife, Spoon, all those cutlery events for free, if not 1 credit, make them very, very, very compelling. And I think just putting together any like good old Anarch deck, putting in your Sure Gambles, your Dirty Laundries, some of your draw options, and some of your cutlery is actually probably worth doing. And I think that's good. So this is a very big deal, and I think this is the only thing that's competing with Temujin on here. Like, there is a slight chance that the prepaid voice pad economies are good enough that they don't need Temujin contract, but I'm pretty sure together they're probably even better, because that's just kind of how Temujin contract works. So I don't know. A lot of people are skeptical about prepaid voice pad, or they used to be even when it was on the most wanted list, because you could technically pay influence for this. A lot of people thought it was a bit too slow, considering how fast you can get your money up with things like Temujin contract. But I think if the meta slows down, which it just might, I think it's probably palatable, and this does have a lot of economy in it. Like, there's a lot of money to be made off of this engine, and I think it's pretty exciting. That's the runner side. 1 card on, 2 cards off. All this other stuff is stuff that not a lot of people have complaints that are on here. So let's just switch over to the corp side real quick. Not a lot of changes here either. I think 1 card came off, and that's our boy here. This is Eli 1.0. Eli 1.0, the standard barrier, a Byroid barrier. 3 to res, 4 to strength, 2 end to run subroutines you can click through. It was a dang good piece of ice, and today I still think it is pretty great. The reason why Eli ended up on the NAPD most wanted list was twofold. Firstly, this guy was only 1 influence, so he was finding his way in most every decks. Remember, the first most wanted list was about a year ago, so the options in deck building weren't as big as they are now, and arguably they're too big now. But so this was like one of the best barriers you could put in your deck in almost any situation. Another big reason why this was on the most wanted list was Corroder used to be your standard breaker, at least before Lady came out. And if you look at the math on Corroder breaks Eli for 4 credits, which is nuts. The idea that you pay 3 credits for an ice and on the first break it costs more than how much you paid to res it is kind of really, really, really good. And yes, you can click through this, but it is half the corp runner's turn, so it makes it hard to rush behind Eli. But if you put your Eli on a central server, put 1 or 2 of them in a row, that's 8 credits if they don't click through it with Corroder, and that was kind of nuts for an ice that was this cheap. And so it was a mixture of its ubiquity and it's just how good it was and how taxing it was that it ended up on the most wanted list. And right now it's come off. And I think there's probably only one big reason why that happened, and that's Paperclip. Paperclip came out and it's kind of replaced Corroder in just about every deck. I'm pretty confident I can say. And Paperclip breaks Eli for 3 credits. Yeah, with 3 to 4 credits might not seem like a big difference, but if you're breaking Eli like maybe 5-6 times a game, that's substantial. Like, that's a lot of savings. So I think with Paperclip around, Eli just becomes 3 credits to break, which isn't unreasonable for the cost of Eli, considering it does have a relatively big downside to it, which means the runner can always click through it. Interestingly enough, even with Paperclip around, I think Eli is probably in the best place it might ever have been. Eli wasn't looking that good when people were playing Atman, because Atman 4 was good against this, or playing Lady. Lady was 1 credit to break this. But I think Eli is getting pretty good right now because of things like other Byroids. I wrote the word Fairchildren. That's not the first time I've done that. Fairchild 3.0 is a pretty ubiquitous ice in most HB decks, and the idea is that people run first click because face planting through this and clicking through it is a lot of times easier and better on tempo than actually either having the subroutines fire or paying the absurd amount of credits to go through this thing. Now, the idea of the Eli around, which is an ice that sometimes you just want to click through, and Fairchild 3.0, I think Eli is actually going to end the run more often than not. Just because if you have an Eli in front of or behind a Fairchild 3.0 and people either don't want to click through the Eli because they'll hit the Fairchild, or if they click through the Fairchild, they'll hit the Eli, like, the Eli is going to end the run more often than not. And I think that's actually really good. And I think Eli is pretty good right now just because there's a lot of HB ice that's been better since Eli hit them, there's a lot of HB ice that just is better since Eli hit the most wanted list. So clicking through this thing is probably not that easy. You have to respect Zeds. You have to respect your Ichis, your Fairchild 3s, your Fairchild 2s, Ravanas. And I think that's makes Eli a lot more, gives it a bit more teeth. Also, Architects of Tomorrow, I think, actually just got a bunch better with this most wanted list update. The biggest problem with the Architects of Tomorrow was it kind of lacked a win condition, and that's going to change a lot with Rumor Mill, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But the idea with Architects of Tomorrow is you just save 3 influence on a really good piece of ice that you generally res for free, let alone you res this for 3 credits, and you can res something else for free. And resing this one for free is not too bad, because this is not a punishing face check, so that's actually really good for Architects of Tomorrow. Because Architects of Tomorrow, a lot of times you don't want to free res ice that you want to surprise the runner with, so you get good value free resing an Eli. I think that's really good. I think that's really, really good. And you might see more Architects of Tomorrow. Is this a reason also to run all the other 8 Biroid support stuff like Brain Taping Warehouse? I don't know, maybe. I don't know. But yeah, Eli's off this list, and that's really important. So that's the 3 cards that are off this list. The only one that's added to here is Bioethics Association. And this is a card that is very crucial to a mixture of either net damage decks or prison decks, which is an archetype that garners a lot of hate, or at least dislike, if that's too strong of a word. Bioethics Association, when your turn begins, you do 1 net damage if there's no ice protecting this. And I think a lot of the design, I don't like a lot of these political assets. There's half of them ended up on this list. If not half, yeah, half of them ended up on this list. But the idea with this card is, it's annoying. And with other recursion cards like Friends in High Places, it can become a problem really fast if you can't deal with it. The basis of a lot of prison decks is that you'll run Bioethics with a card called Hostile Infrastructure. And the idea is that if the Bioethics fires, you get hurt. If Hostile Infrastructure is up and you trash the Bioethics, you get hurt. So at some point in time, if the runner's not like very carefully keeping up with the board state and trashing all these things and drawing cards, it's very easy for a single Friends in High Places to bring back some combination of Hostile Infrastructures and Bioethics Associations, and you can put the runner in a pretty no-win situation, because if they trash them, they take net damage. If they don't trash them, they take more net damage. And it can become very difficult. And that's a lot of times what Jinteki prison decks want to do. They want to put the runner in a situation where they just can't keep up with the net damage and eventually they succumb to their wounds. This doesn't ruin that, I don't think. And I think it's actually okay for this game for prison archetypes to exist. I don't think it's good if they're the superior way to play the game and they're the best way to play the game. Just because if you go to a tournament, you don't want to be playing just all prison decks. I think prison decks should be something that are only good if you're like good at playing them, and that comes with experience. And if someone wants to build that and enjoy that, what's up, Mordecai? So be it. That's cool. I just hope they're not ubiquitous, and this sort of change kind of pushes it that way. It makes them less strong. I still think they're kind of viable. These sort of acid spammy prison decks did take a hit with Sensi's Actor Union, a card below we'll get to in a bit. I keep saying that, but it's a very important change. So I don't know what kind of hit they'll take. This card is probably still worth the 1 influence inside your potential Unleashed deck that wants to fire these off only once or twice even, just to get the cheeky net damage, and are not looking to like really be a prison. I think that's fine. This ability is really good, and forcing Jinteki decks to pay 1 influence for it is probably not out of line. And I also don't think it'll crush that archetype. It just makes it so it's harder for them to bring other things into the deck. Like now they have to consider how their influence from Friends in High Places is going to come from if they also have to pay 1 influence for this thing. And I think that's fine. I think that's okay. It's going to be seen how that pans out, but I don't think it kills anything. It kills that archetype. I don't think people splash Bioethics Association out of faction. If you're playing 3 influence for this, where would you put it? Gagarin maybe, but I don't think that's that great either. So You'll see this in Jiteki, and when you see it, you'll be happy they paid an influence for it. I think that's what it comes down to. Anywho, that's all that happened on this side on level 1, but we gotta jump down to level 3. Quickly, all these other cards are cards that were just very, very, very good, or kind of like just the only... Like, the idea with NAPD contract, it was so good for a 4-2, people weren't playing other 4-2s. You could argue that with Temujin existing, NAP contract could come off the most wanted list. I don't think it would be terrible, just because we have had other good 4-2s come out since then. Like, I think corporate sales team is, in a lot of cases, preferable to NAPD contract. But I'll rather err on this conservative most wanted list thing, just because this card was everywhere. I don't like Mumba Temple. Anyways, this is level 3! And this is new, unplotted territory. Unplotted? And these cards are now worth +3 influence. And if you notice here, there's what, like 6 cards? 4 of them are Anarch, which is kind of nuts. And I think tells you a lot of why, well, Anarch design has just been kind of nutso for the last little while. And if you notice, if you look at Worlds 2016 results, the majority of everything is Anarch. The majority of everything is also Shaper. I mean, not Shaper, NBN. So I'm glad things look like this, because it'll be interesting to take Anarch down a bit, because they're just generally been a bit too good and too reliable, which isn't something that Anarch was ever meant to be. Like, Anarch and reliable, the same sentence. That shouldn't be right. Anywho, let's talk about all of these, because all this is pretty new. 3 influence plus 3 influence is a pretty big deal. And let's start here with Blackmail. Blackmail was an event that came out during the spin cycle, and one of the big themes of the spin cycle was the idea of bad publicity and kind of pushing it to its limits, or at least exploring it. And there was a lot of runner cards, not a lot, there was some runner cards that gave you bad publicity. I think it was only like Frame Job, right? And there was a lot of corp cards that gave bad publicity. I'm thinking of mostly all this really bad Wayland Ice that didn't see play ever. But the real reason why anyone would ever consider playing using bad publicity was singularly because of this card Blackmail. And Blackmail was a totally nuts card. If you have bad pub, make a run, the corp can't res ice, you basically can't protect anything. And this card is a huge issue. This card, I guess, is what a lot of people would call a negative play experience. I guess it's not as negative as some other more negative play experiences like Data Leak Reversal or Account Siphon, stuff like that. But the idea was if you were playing a deck and you couldn't res your ice out of turn, or you didn't have defensive upgrades, you basically, and specifically if you had to advance your agendas, you were basically out of luck. Like, you were just in a really bad spot. Because as soon as you install advance, if you don't have traps in your deck, and a lot of people don't run those, they just blackmail it and they take it. If you can't follow that up with mid-seasons or what have you, you're in a really, really bad spot. Blackmail is a super nuts card, and there's very little counterplay with it, and most of the counterplay against Blackmail happened during deck building, which isn't something I'm a big fan of. And I know a lot of people don't like Blackmail. It's just not interactive. They're like the 17 ice you put in your deck are now useless. In a lot of situations, that's not great. I think actually the worst part of Blackmail is not how good it was, but how easy it was to recur it. If you're playing this in Anarch, and a lot of people, if not exclusively, Blackmail was played in Anarch, a lot of people would play this with things like Deja Vu and Same Old Thing, and then even maybe a Levy AR Lab access. Actually, maybe not. But the idea was with Deja Vu and Same Old Thing and 3 Blackmails, you could play 9 Blackmails in a game. So it was kind of really hard for a corp to score things behind ice if they weren't running defensive upgrades. So I'm glad that this is on the most wanted list. This now costs 3 influence, which is going to make you consider whether or not you run this at all. Do you run Blackmail? I think you could. I honestly think you actually might be able to get away with running Blackmail. I think you'd only run 1 though. I think you could play a deck that runs 1 Blackmail, which kind of sounds nuts. You're paying 3 influence for 1 Blackmail, which is a lot, but this card actually does get its 3 influence worth. Admittedly, once we talk about Rumor Mill, there might actually be more defensive upgrades, so Blackmail might not be as good as it once was, but it's still, like, obviously a really, really good card. So if you're playing 3 influence for this card and you want putting only 1 in your deck, specifically if you're playing Valencia Estevez, who is generally the Blackmail runner, it's going to be hard to find your 1 of 50 cards. So you have to kind of find it yourself. And I think the thing that you could do is perhaps consider running Planned Assault. This card's only 2 influence. I played a lot of this in Anarch. You could also maybe try doing this in Criminal with that current that gives you bad publicity. That seems like a crazy amount of pieces, but it also gets a lot more affordable if you're running prepaid voice pad. But the idea with Plan to Assault is you pay a double, and now you can find your blackmail and play it. Once you do play it, it's going to be in your heap, and then you can always recur it with all your deja vus and all your same old things, and you can recur that single blackmail over and over again. I don't think the strategy is going to exist for more than maybe a week when Terminal Directive comes out, and then Scorpios comes out, and then you can't really count on recurring things too much. But enjoy this week, I guess. Maybe that won't catch on. I don't know. But the idea is like Plan to Assault isn't terrible in Anarch. I actually played a lot of Plan to Assault in account siphon decks in Anarch, and getting your account siphon is good too, but being able to Plan to Assault to find your cutlery is actually pretty reasonable. Being able to like think, oh, I need my fork right now, I'll play Plan to Assault to find my fork. Like, that's not awful. And I know you're paying 5 influence for one Plan to Assault and 1 blackmail, and maybe that doesn't sound good, but I'm just saying it is possible. It's kind of possible. I don't think it's worth it though, I'll be honest. The next question is, which is actually arguably more interesting, is Valencia Estevez dead? And I also think I can like more confidently say no. I think there's still much value in playing Valencia. The big reason why a lot of people played Valencia, and I think this was actually when newer players come, they see Valencia and like really gravitate towards just blackmail spamming, which I don't think is great Netrunner. I think Valencia Estevez's ability is still really good. Having a bad publicity, yes, it does turn on blackmail, but it's also like having a built-in Desperado in a lot of ways. Yes, you're not getting that credit to your bank, but you're making every single run in the whole game 1 credit cheaper. You're making every time you trash an asset or upgrade 1 cheaper. And yes, Wizard makes once per turn that 3 cheaper, but I think Wizard might actually not be as ubiquitous as he once was, due to the changes of things like Sensi's Actor Union and Bioethics Association in a smaller way. But I think the meta is actually going to slow down, and I think a lot of decks are going to kind of veer away from the asset strategy. So I think Valencia Estevez, for that bigger deck size, isn't so great, but having 1 bad publicity is probably comparable to Wizard. The main reason why I feel mostly confident about this is that there's a dude in Ottawa, his name is Alex, it goes online by Loper. He won the Canadian Nationals this year, and he's been playing a lot of Valencia Estevez since she came out, really. And his decks were actually pretty interesting. I think Dean from Toronto was actually playing some of these too, but a lot of them didn't actually run 3 blackmails. They ran maybe sometimes 2 blackmails, and probably like 1 deja vu, maybe 1 same old thing. And I think he was running, those were actually mostly for Levy AR lab access. But the idea was that he wasn't counting on these blackmails. If he drew them, he would use them, but he wouldn't play his Valencia like a lot of people do, where they don't run because they don't want people to res ice, so their blackmails are useless. The blackmail was just basically a utility tool that you played like an undercosted inside job, a superior inside job in a lot of ways, and that's good. And I even think Valencia Estevez without blackmail is probably worth considering. I think 50 card size, 50 deck size is not as big of a problem with things like frantic coding, even with the conspiracy breakers, and or just running inject, and I've had worse and all that sort of stuff. Like, I don't think it's that bad, so I don't think she's actually like totally dead in the water. I think she actually might be considered played, but the fact that blackmail doesn't exist, fine. Want to pay 3 influence for 1 copy, you might be able to get away with it, but maybe not. That's good. Don't like blackmail. Don't like it. Let's move on to DDoS. This is a virtual resource, and it says the corp can't res the outermost piece of ice during a run on any server this turn, and this card is absurd. I really didn't like this card when it came out, just because it's so obviously comparable to Inside Job, and this sort of bypassing ice thing, and I know DDoS doesn't say bypass, but the ability to bypass ice was meant to be like specifically a criminal thing. And for 1 credit more, you have a card that bypasses multiple pieces of ice in theory on multiple servers for the entire turn. That always left a sour taste in my mouth, the idea that Inside Job, the like one of the most quintessential criminal cards, is outclassed by an Anarch resource that, yeah, just why? Thematically, it's on point though, so I'll give him that. DDoS landed on the most wanted list, I think, for 2 big reasons. The first is the Count Siphon Cheese. This card's really important. I'm pretty sure it was in Dan Dargenia's winning deck list of 2015, and it was definitely in Ben Nee's 2016 World's Runner-Up deck. And these were both decks that were Anarch decks that ran DDoS. I'm pretty sure Dan ran DDoS, but they also ran a Count Siphon. And the thing you'll notice here is that it is super easy, if you get good draw, mind you, for turn 1, for you to play a DDoS if there's 1 ice on HQ, and then just pop it and then put your count siphon, and your count siphon will 100% land. The corp won't be able to res the ice, so they can't like dodge the count siphon, and it'll just straight out go through. And that's just gross. I don't like that. The fact that you have an unconditional turn 1 account siphon is pretty bad. If you get perfect draw, like that's really strong. And these sort of decks run Data Leak Reversal and Wireless Net Pavilion and Fall Guy. And if you got the corp down to 0 credits, you were in a pretty good line of winning the game. And the fact that like a lot of the winning strategies against Max or against even Valencia were double ice HQ turn 1 and hope you have 2 ice, and if you don't, you might just lose. That kind of sucked. So I'm glad you can't just account siphon cheese turn 1. Also, like keyhole cheesing was something that always rubbed me the wrong way. They could just put on DDoS and keyhole 3 times. Didn't like that. And compare that to Inside Job, where you can't even keyhole once. Like that always bothered me, but I don't know. I think the bigger reason why this ended up on the most wanted list was something called Diaper. And Diaper is a portmanteau of the name Hyperdriver and DDoS. So there's the DDoS in it. And you'll notice this deck is now 8 influence over the most wanted list because of the most wanted list, which I find hilarious. So if you're not familiar with Diaper, the quick rundown, it is a very solitaire deck. This is a deck that it's a combo deck, which is something that exists in all other sorts of card games, things like Hearthstone, things like Magic. They're decks that don't want to interact with the corporation or with your opponent, but they just want to build up this win condition. And once they have it, they fire and they basically win. They almost always win. And this one can set up pretty fast if you have good draw. A lot of these combo decks depend on draw. But the basic idea is that you run Hyperdriver. You get all your hyperdrivers down, you can manage to do it, and then you have a turn with 14 or 15 clicks. And then when you have that, you have your 1 copy of DDoS, which you pop so the runner can't, or the corp can't res their outermost piece of ice. And then using False Echo, a card that hasn't seen play anywhere else besides DDoS hyperdriver decks, you DDoS past the first piece of ice, you bounce it with False Echo because you passed a piece of unresed ice, so it's returned to HQ. And now the next piece of ice is now considered the innermost piece of ice, so you can't res it again with DDoS. And then you False Echo that, and you rinse and repeat until there's 1 piece of ice on R&D, which they can't res, mind you, because DDoS says for the entire turn they can't res the outermost piece of ice. And then you proceed to keyhole them roughly 13 times. And then you generally win. There's more technicalities about that, like putting on HQ pressure, running archives, all that sort of stuff. But you get the idea that you can generally just close the game off after making 13 keyholes. It doesn't seem unreasonable, does it? And this deck list just kind of got whacked pretty hard here. There's a lot of cards on here, like 8 influence over suddenly from the most wanted list change means that this is going to be pretty hard to wrangle this down to playable, at least at a competitive level. Do I know if it's impossible whether to make changes to make this work? I don't, because I never played this archetype, so I'm not actually an expert on it. So maybe it is possible to get this thing working. Maybe you do drop your Faust, maybe you do drop your Apocalypse. This deck list has Apocalypse, that's pretty nuts. By the way, this top 16 of worlds, like this is a good thing to do. Yeah, maybe it is possible, I'm not entirely sure, but DDoS basically existed in 2 decks. Account Siphon turn 1, which sucked, and Hyperdriver Kate, which I don't think combo decks are terrible for the game, but I wish they weren't as reliable as Hyperdriver Kate is, and I wish they had a bit more interactivity than these sort of Hyperdriver Kate or Haley decks. So that's why it's on here. Not an issue, I don't think. Like, I don't know, a lot of people enjoyed those deck lists, so whatever. I don't think that changes much on the meta. I also don't think blackmail changes much on the meta, whether or not it exists. I think without blackmail, there's less of a reason. I was meant to talk about what this changes on the meta, right? With blackmail off of it, I think there's less of a reason to run cards that res out a turn, and there's less of a reason to run bad pub removal cards like Lizzie Mills, I guess. Doesn't change really much, but it's one less thing that you have to worry about if your deck loses to blackmail, so that's good. In terms of DDoS, again, very little, just because there's not that much counterplay against this. If you're playing against DDoS, all you had to do was double ice your server, but if you're playing against Hyper, these like Diaper decks, you just kind of had to win fast or res a whole lot of ice, and that's kind of difficult to do a lot of times. One thing worth noting is this is the first card that's now cost 6 influence. If you want to splash this card into Shaper, it's 6 influence. Isn't that crazy? This is Faust. I'm actually not going to spend that long talking about Faust. Faust has been kind of an issue since it came out. The idea, basically, it's cheap to install and it breaks ice for no money. And it's actually not that hard to draw cards considering things like Wildside, which also ended up on this most wanted list. But the idea is that you can draw a lot of cards, break anything. If you're running Cutlery or cards that trash ice, you generally only break it once and then you don't have to deal with it again. So it's not hard to have a card that gets into every server and all you need to do is draw cards. And this kind of like really messed up with the game pretty heavily. And now if you want this, it's going to cost you 5 influence out of faction and 3 influence in faction. Do I think it's still playable? I don't know. I'm pretty sure with a mixture of all these other cards that are on the list, alongside Faust, it actually might be difficult to build yourself a compelling Dumble Fork deck. For those who are not initiated, Dumble Fork is the idea of running Faust alongside Cutlery. It's one of these big boy decks. It's pretty good. It's been around in the competitive scene for a long time and people are still playing it to date. Even like just a month ago, it was still pretty popular. It might actually be pretty hard to build a compelling Faust deck right now, just because that is a lot of influence to ask for a single card, and generally they were running 2 of them, if not 3. I think 2 is the sweet number. So that's, even if it is possible, it's going to be worse than it was before, just because you lose, like, what? You lose 4 influence, because this card used to be 1 influence, right? This does unfortunately impact a lot of the more zany decks. There's a lot of criminal decks that were super aggressive that would run a single Faust. There's a lot of like ridiculous Bagbiter game day decks that would run a single Faust. And it's kind of unfortunate that those interesting decks did get taken down a peg just because Faust now cost them 5 influence. Is it impossible to spend 5 influence for a breaker and criminal? It might not be entirely, but it's yet to be seen. Less Faust is good. I think that'll impact, I think now the value of anti-AI cards might not be as good as they used to be. Like IP block is not looking that sweet if people are not playing Faust. I think wraparound probably isn't worth being considered at any point in time anymore. What else? Swordsman, not so hot. And do people still play Turing? I don't think I've seen Turing in maybe a couple of months either, but that's kind of cool. That opens a design space. You can now play ice that has less subroutines, bigger strength, stuff like that. Things that you used to be worried that were going to be trashed by Faust and Cutlery. I think that's fine. And I think overall that opens the kind of ice that you can play, and I think that's pretty good. But that's Faust. It's kind of a nuts card, and it's going to end up on this list eventually, so now it's a lot of influence. So the last 3 cards are the ones I think I wanted to talk about the most because they have the biggest impact on the meta 100%, or at least 2 of them do. This is Rumor Mill, and Rumor Mill is this Princess Space Kitten here. It's a current event, cost 1, Anarch, like most of these things. And it says the text box of each unique non-region asset and upgrade is blank. And this card had the biggest impact on the meta. I think the only other card that had that big of an impact on the meta was Faust. The idea with Rumor Mill, just Rumor Mill's existence invalidated so many win strategies in Netrunner. It blanks unique upgrades, and that's a really big deal. These are all the unique upgrades. This also has regions in it, but ignore those. But at least 3 of these upgrades were incredibly powerful, and those are probably in order: Caprice Nassau, our friend here Ash, and Marcus Batty. And Marcus Batty is impactful, but I think let's just talk about Caprice. Glacier is what it's called, the strategy of strapping a lot of ice on the server and then scoring your agendas behind that ice. Now, the thing with ice is that a runner can get through ice, so you kind of want something in that server that makes it so that if they run through that server, they still don't get in. Maybe they have to run it twice, and it multiplies the effectiveness of your server. If a server costs 3 to get in and you put a Caprice on it and now they have to run it 3 times to get in, your server now costs 9, let alone the money they pay for Caprice and trashing it. And that's kind of better value, let alone much better value than just putting another piece of ice on that server, let alone sometimes the runner just can't get in because they can't win the side game. Caprice was good. Caprice was in the if you have the 2015 World's Championship deck with the full arts, you have 2 copies of Caprice Nassau, I believe. And that's a big reason that HB deck spent 8 influence on Caprice, because it was basically the way it won the game. Caprice with Ash, mind you, is also pretty nuts, but that deck also ran Ash as well. Now, you'll notice that this idea, the ability to have a card that really protects an agenda behind ice, these are all unique, and all these defensive upgrades, once Rumor Mill came out, and this card is trivially easy to play, it's relatively easy to splash, but it's the same problem with Blackmail. In a faction that has access to 3 same old things, 3 deja vus, this card was on the table at all points in time, in theory. And so with Rumor Mill around, the idea that you could play a strategy in which you can score agendas behind ice with upgrades became entirely invalid. invalidated, almost entirely invalidated, and people just didn't play this anymore, and people stopped playing Glacier. Admittedly, there's other reasons why there was a downfall of Glacier. Cards like Cipher generally don't help. Cards like Parasite and Faust kind of don't help either, that now getting through ice or trashing ice gets a lot easier. So all of these things kind of work together, but a big reason of the downfall was Caprice Nisse. It was Rumor Mill, blanking these things. With Rumor Mill on this list and costing whopping 5 influence out of faction and 3 influence in faction, there is a belief that this sort of Glacier 2014 style Netrunner is going to become a thing again. And this excites a lot of people because the idea of having servers with multiple pieces of ice and making impactful single runs and all that is really exciting Netrunner. And for someone who's played since that era, I agree. There's actually been a lot of fun, even against replicating perfection decks with the Caprice and all that. Like it's honestly good old Netrunner, and I'm looking forward to that to some extent. I'm very happy that this entire archetype, which from my understanding was the archetype when Netrunner came out, besides having invincible traps, it looks like it's on good legs again, and that's going to be cool. The existence of this card, or the non-existence of this card, the existence of this card on the most wanted list is going to have a really, 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 really big deal in the meta. If you're expecting cards like Caprice Nisse to see play and Ash, you can look forward to a lot of things like Engineering the Future, a lot of Food Coats type stacks. You can look forward to a lot of Palana seeing play again. You can see Replicating Perfection. I said Palana right the first time and then I goofed it the second time. Great. Replicating Perfection should see play again. Architects of Tomorrow also can get use out of, maybe not Caprice so much, but maybe Ash. Maybe you can splash a Caprice. And all these things are just now new IDs and new ways to play the game. You could even arguably play like a Glacier NBN deck. I think they have the ice to support it. Maybe they're lacking the economy. But the idea is it is now largely possible. And that really excites me. That's really cool. That's really cool. Now, you got to understand that if this becomes popular, it's not going to be rare to see an Engineering the Future deck that runs like Fairchild 3 with 2 Caprice in their deck. So it's going to be hard to get into servers. So you're going to have to prepare for it. And there's a lot of ways to do it. Political Operative, I think, is the most compelling way. This is 1 influence. It's nothing if you play in Criminal. But the idea is after you run HQ, you have this card that lets you blow up a Caprice whenever you want. And that's incredibly powerful. I could see myself putting 2 of these in every Criminal deck for a while going forward, assuming the meta pans out the way I think it will. But even splashing 1 or 2 of these in Shaper and Anarch seems really good. The US Nationals winning deck, we had this on our camera, you can watch on the YouTube channel, was a Wizard deck. It ran 1 Political Operative. It was one of the large reasons why it won. Of course, Josh Wilson is obviously a very good Netrunner player, but you can see if you watch those games how much work Political Operative does. I'm not trying to invalidate Josh Wilson's play. Otherwise, you have things like Councilman. It's good, works really well with Political Operative. You have things like Drive-By. I don't think you have to hyphenate that. Drive-By is also pretty great. Another way to trash things, and if you want to spend no influence and you just want to do it your simple way, you have Interdiction. And these are all like compelling enough ways to do it. Are we actually getting to a point where Analog Dreamers works? Is it Dreams? Is this going to do it? Make a runner on-res non-ice card now. This is never going to work. But the idea is that you do have a lot of tools, and I think those tools are much more interesting ways to deal with these upgrades rather than just playing Rumor Mill and everything being blank and there's very little counterplay to it. Admittedly, there is a bit of apprehension and a slight bit of negativity about this, just because Caprice Nisse did not exist in a meta where Friends in High Places did. Classically, if you want to bring your Caprice back, it was a pretty time-intensive act in which you spend majority of your turn internsing it back. And I remember that being frustrating when it happened. But now with Friends in High Places, you pay a bit more money, but you can bring back a Caprice and an Ash. You can bring back a Caprice and an Ice. You can bring back a Caprice and a Caprice. And that might be an issue considering this card only costs 1 influence. So prepare for this, because that actually seems really good. An HB deck that can bring back a Campaign or a Breaker Bay Grid and their Caprice in a single action seems like a good deck. How do you prepare for this? Remove things from games. I think Archive's interface is looking better than ever. You can always also run Salset Slums if you haven't, but this card actually I think looks particularly nice just because it's a hardware. You can run Archives, get value with your Temujin, what have you, and removing things from the game, even removing operations from the game, might get you more value in the long run than your Salset Slums. Like removing Friends in High Places from the games gets you a lot of value. And I think this is a compelling card for 2 influence to run, even in Criminal, even maybe in Shaper, I don't know. But just be careful because with these these powerful, like if you're spending 4 influence on a single card in HB, you're gonna recur it just to get the most value you did out of that 4 to 8 influence you spent on these. Now there's some really weird kind of like I don't know, this doesn't make that much sense, but I'm pretty sure this is true. If you look at the last 6 months worth of competitive Anarch decks, you notice that Rumor Mill wasn't in a lot of them. And it was just the fear of Rumor Mill alone that discouraged people to playing Caprice Nisse and all these upgrades. And largely it is just the idea that there's a chance that you had a matchup that your win rate was like 10% or what have you. Just because your only winning strategy was advance with upgrades, and if they had Rumor Mill, and the chance they did, what can you do? And so just like the threat alone of Rumor Mill made those decks they didn't much exist. Now with Rumor Mill being on the most wanted list, I think people are going to think you're not going to see it at all, which kind of counterintuitively makes Rumor Mill the most powerful it's ever been. Putting this on the most wanted list did the most to make Rumor Mill good, as much as it was always good, that I actually could see an Anarch deck paying 3 influence, maybe even 6 influence for 2 of these. Just because with Rumor Mill on here, I'm going to see the majority of competitive corporation decks, if they're not like fast events or they're not still prisoning or asset spamming, are actually going to try and score with Caprice and Ash. And if you can surprise them with a Rumor Mill, which they don't think is going to be in the game, mind you, because you spent 6 influence for these 2, you nutter, you're going to win a lot of games. Like, I honestly think that Rumor Mill being on this list does the most it could possibly do for Rumor Mill, just because it really encourages people to run upgrades. Unique upgrades. So that's kind of weird, and I want to see how that pans out. My plan right now is kind of to run criminal decks, to run 2 political operatives, 2 councilmans, and probably off-campus apartment, because those cards are fun in conjunction. But I honestly think running Rumor Mill is probably okay. Like, out of all these cards, I think that one's going to give you the most value, just because it automatically turns off corp strategies, while DDoS, Faust, Blackmail, and Cipher just kind of make better decks. Weird, huh? This is Cipher. I made a video when Cipher came out. It's maybe like 45 minutes. All these videos get too long, huh? Talking about why this card is unprecedented, and it's kind of busted how good it is, and it's now on the most wanted list. Interesting thing is this is the first time a card has been on the most wanted list without it existing for 6 months in the wild. There's a rule that they said when they made the most wanted list, but there's also a rule when they made the most wanted list saying they would update it every 6 months. So I don't know what these rules matter, but mind you, this card has only been out for like 4 or something months, but it's on the most wanted list, which is unprecedented. And I think a large portion of this, it was because people hate this card. A lot of people really complain about this card. I don't think it's great. I think it really limits my design, and I'm very frustrated when I play against it. It limits the design of my corp decks, but yeah, so I think in a lot of ways, I also heard from I don't know if these are rumors because they haven't actually been confirmed, but a lot of I think Michael Boggs has said that there's cards coming out in the Red Sand cycle that are going to make Cipher a lot worse. So he says that this is not necessary, but nonetheless, Cipher now costs 4 or 3 influence depending in or out of faction, so you're going to probably see a lot less of it. Anarch consoles are really good, so I think if you're paying money for influence for Cipher, you probably just want to play Obelisk, or you probably just want to play Maw. Like, I don't know if you can actually afford to spend 3 influence for a console, let alone 6 for 2 of these. Yes, it is a good ability, but if you want to attach this with Parasite, that's 3 more influence, so what, you're paying 9 influence already, just to start? I don't know if that's possible, and this is the biggest argument why people wanted to make this mono orange deck, and why the Professor rule no longer exists, so it's going to be a lot harder to do that. Maybe it is possible, I don't entirely know. More importantly, it's not going to be nearly as good as it once was. If you're spending 4 influence for this out of faction, there was a lot of good Shaper decks that would self-modifying code into the single Parasite and trash everything. And if they want to run 1 Cipher, that might be possible, but they'll have to tutor their Ciphers, so there's like 2 cards that tutor hardware, and they're not particularly effective or efficient, more accurately. So that's probably not that great anymore. I don't know. But it's Cipher. If you want to know a bit of my opinions on it, you can watch that video. Otherwise, I just think it's kind of nuts. The most unfortunate thing about like losing Cipher, and this kind of happens when any power card goes down, is that all these other like decks associated with it lose a lot of their viability. Like there was this Los deck that I made that got it was the deck list of the week, so maybe you saw it a couple weeks ago. But the idea was that it ran Cipher. And now we're 8 influence over. But the idea is that you kind of needed Sifra in this deck because we were running all these bird breakers, and these bird breakers are, oh, that's not even a bird breaker. These bird breakers were they're pretty expensive to use. And Sifra made this deck work. As much as we weren't technically abusing Sifra in the Parasite way or any of that like ridiculous Yogg stuff, it's kind of a shame that this deck doesn't work anywhere nearly as good. And I don't think this deck was like busted. It was kind of just fun. So things like that go down, just like that with Faust and mostly other things with Faust. So what can you do? But anyways, glad that we don't have to deal with Sifra. There's other good Anarch consoles. Play Maw. I think this is good. You'll see less Sifra, and that's great. Final card, Sensei's Actor Union. All right. If you've been listening to this channel, this is the card that I've complained most about over the last while. About a card that's been affecting my enjoyment of this game, and I'm really glad to see that this now costs 3 influence or 5 influence out of faction. This is Sensei Actors Union. This card is nuts. It's totally nuts. This card costs nothing to res, and if it fires, you just drew 4 cards with your mandatory draw, and cycled, probably protected your agenda on the bottom of R&D, the safest place for it ever to be. Nobody plays Showing Off. So what happens? Like, if this fires, if you're playing unprotected assets, there's a big chance you're playing a deck that runs like 23 assets. So if this fires, you just drew 4 cards, which means you're probably likely to draw 3 more assets, which means you're likely to play 3 more assets this turn. And if the runner didn't trash this, now they have to trash this before considering trashing your other cards, which is going to be a huge tax because you're probably playing something like Controlling the Message, which taxes the runner out. Every time they want to, well, the first time at least, they want to trash a thing. Now they have to deal with this trace or this tag. And of course you're playing hard-hitting news. The point being, this card was nuts. It gave so much value to the corporation for no credits. It was like such a low risk play. You pay nothing for it. You get 3 more cards. You asset spam that out. You keep going. It just keeps rolling. If you can't deal with it, you don't have the money. Hard hitting news, you lose. I'm being a bit hyperbolic, but this actually was a card where if you couldn't contest it on turn 1, your win rates plummeted. And it had a huge impact on the meta because people were having to run decks which were able to contest this turn 1. Because if this fires turn 1, the amount of tempo the corp gains that they can now throw themselves so far ahead of the runner who, mind you, didn't contest this turn 1, that the runner is in such a bad spot. And now I'm glad that this is harder to put in a deck. If not, I don't think it's impossible, but at least harder. Because so many runners were building their deck around being able to deal with this turn 1, like a single card, right? Like Wizard was super popular because it was not uncommon for this to be spammed out turn 1 in a Controlling the Message, and you have to deal with it, and you'll get your 2 credits worth of your Wizard ability. People will have to play, Temujin has to be everywhere just because you have to deal with this. Salsa Slums had to be everywhere. Like, it's a big deal. And this card is one of the biggest enablers of asset spam strategies, and if it doesn't exist, it's going to be a lot harder to spam assets. And that's really good because that's a strategy that I know I don't love. And the biggest part of it is I don't like its ubiquity. There were so many decks that were very viable that ran 25 assets or what have you. And if you're not playing Wizard, it was very hard to keep up with them. And it was very much that kind of deck that I think your chances of winning were, like, the more meaningful decisions about how often you were going to win were done in deck building. And that's true of most decks, but a lot of times specialists, specifically new players, would really get frustrated against this card. Because if they couldn't deal with it turn 1, it's bad. And if their deck wasn't able to trash, 40, 50 credits worth of assets by turn whatever number I make up, it was pretty bad too. So I'm glad it's gone. Not entirely gone, right? 5 influence out of faction, I don't think it'll see a lot of play. Some Gagarin decks, some Industrial Genomics decks would splash 1 or 2 of these, but I don't think for 5 influence you can afford to do that unless at some point in the future we get an asset or an event or something that gets one of these out on the table during beginning of turn while it still fires. So just before beginning of turn trigger, so you get your value out of it. Right now, the only option we have is tech startup, and if you tech startup Sensei's Actor Union, it won't fire because it wasn't there during start of turn. So if we get a tutor like that, which I think would be a big mistake, honestly, this card could be splashed. Maybe, for 5 influence, maybe. In faction, it's actually pretty hard to splash. Specifically in the deck they used it the most was Controlling the Message, which already has only, which only has 12 influence. So if you're spending 3 on one of these, that's really, really, really rough. And I don't know if you can afford to do that. If any deck could run this in yellow, it's probably Near Earth Hub. Maybe Harsh Sashandra, but mostly Near Earth Hub, just because When you install it, you get a card draw, and you can maybe put 2 of these in your deck and just still play with 11 influence. Like all the other Corp decks were playing with 12 influence with 3 Jackson Howards anyways, right? So maybe you can get away with it. NBN. But yeah, existence of this, or the non-existence of this, really slows everything down. That's great. That's really good. And I think these cards have a huge impact on the meta, because not having to deal with an asset turn 1 is huge. Like now what is the controlling the message going to put down? Yeah, they might score a Naked Astro. Actually, that actually seems pretty viable. But it's going to be a pad campaign. Maybe it's a commercial bankers group. Who cares? But the idea is that the card that they put down turn 1 is less likely to be a card that you have to trash. So you can take your turn 1 to put down your prepaid voice pad. You can take your turn 1 to put down your Magnum and click it. You can take your turn 1 to do something else. And you don't, in theory, have to be super aggressive. Is Wizard still good? Yes. If people are playing assets and upgrades, Wizard is still fine. If replicating perfection becomes a thing, Wizard's still good. But this really excites me because I think this opens up the viability, because so much of competitive Netrunner, at least for me, has been dealing with a single card. And it's just an absurd card. Yeah, 5 influence or 3 in faction. That's meaningful. And that's the most wanted list. We did it. Man, these videos, huh? So yeah, that's the list. We've gone through the changes. Temujin got on here, 2 cards got off. We got Bioethics, got back Eli, and then all this stuff. And this basically hits a lot of Anarch stuff, hits a lot of negative play experience stuff, a lot of stuff that generally has been way too undercosted. Like Faust is harder to use. Cipher's not gonna be everywhere. I still think Rumor Mill's worth the time and money. I really do think it's actually worth it more than ever, which is kind of weird. And no sensies. I think it's good. I think the meta, likely, it's yet to be seen from, I haven't been able to play too much in it considering I wasn't around for the weekend, but I've been talking to my friends in the meta, and they've been saying they've been enjoying playing Prepaid Kate, feels like 2014. Replicating Perfection seems to feel like in a good spot. I imagine Polana can pull it off pretty well. I've heard from a friend who's playing Nearth Hub and said that the missing senses actually mattered a lot because filtering your hand wasn't that good and you couldn't spam out assets too much. So even if you do play Wizard, it's so much easier to keep up with the assets. And if this thing doesn't fire, cards in hand do actually group up like your agendas and hands. A lot of people say now that Senses is gone, you can run Daily Business Show. And I'm fine with that. Like, I think Daily Business Show is a much more fair card. It costs money to res. It is a bit harder to trash, right? And this card does filter agendas out of HQ, but it doesn't accelerate your asset spam strategy. I'm a big fan of this card. I missed this card actually because I think it actually is very interesting design. Because trashing this, if you don't trash this, the quality running HQ is garbage. It gets really bad. So I don't know. I think this will take its place. Anyways, I'm hoping things slow down. I think things will slow down, which is good because it lets a lot of the more Shaper type runners get in there. And we haven't seen a lot of Shaper just because they're not very good at contesting with assets turn 1. And I think that will change a lot. One thing worth saying, and this is going to bother me, I have a game night kit on Saturday and I'm planning to bring Jemison. But I know if a lot of people play Shaper, you have access to Clot, and that's an issue if I'm trying to fast advance. So if you're trying to fast advance, prepare for Clot. Maybe run an Arc Lockdown, maybe run some Cyberdex Virus Suites. But I'm sure Shaper's going to come back in a meaningful way just because they're pretty good at getting their accesses in. Even that Exile deck I've been playing, if they don't play a fast deck, the Corp doesn't play something like Asset Spammy, you have pretty good odds. I think also Geist got a lot better, but we'll see when Scorpios comes out. I think last thing I just want to touch on really quickly, this is Aaron Moran. And I know we mentioned Cipher getting on this list with not being around for 6 months. And this was the other card I think a lot of people expected to be on the most wanted list. And I think this one fell in the category of hasn't been out long enough and wasn't that big an issue comparatively to Cipher that it didn't make the list. Yes, this card is very good, and it actually might be a bit too good, but I think this is the kind of card that we'll see once they reevaluate the list in hopefully only 2 to 4 months. I think the most wanted list needs to be updated quicker, whether or not this sees it. But right now, I'm pretty sure this just didn't get the treatment just because it hasn't been out for long enough. And even if there's a card that like just hates on yellow and hates on breaking news, I think that's fine. But the fact that it hates on almost all tagging ice and makes a count siphon a bit too good, that's a bit rough. But if that's kind of like the casualty of making that a yellow deck doesn't win worlds, it's not like it always has, right? Like we've had a replicating perfection in HB and all that stuff, but there's been a lot of yellow recently in competitive play, and whatever. Let's see if we can shift that away, I guess. That's the most wanted list. I'm pretty positive about it. I've seen on Jinteki.net the day it came out, there's so many more competitive lobbies. I haven't been playing a lot of competitive lobby games on this channel just because it has been kind of hard recently to find competitive lobbies And that's because, like, at least here, regionals are really far away, so not a lot of people are playing competitive. But that's really good. It's a really exciting time for Netrunner because deck building has just been blown wide open. Not only the cards that you can put in your deck, things like prepaid voice pad economies and stuff like that, but the idea that you don't have to build a deck around super power cards. Like, you don't have to worry about Cipher that much. You don't have to worry about Rumor Mill that much. And you don't have to worry about Sensi's turn 1. It makes this a really big deal. And I'm super excited to design some decks. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned the rest of this week. We're streaming on Thursday, but I'm going to try and get up some prepaid decks of some sort as of tomorrow to get some videos up. But otherwise, we're just going to kind of like keep going with this most wanted list, see what we can do. We got a G&K on Saturday, so hopefully Jamison pulls through. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know what you think about this most wanted list. What kind of stuff are you excited to build? I think there's a lot of freedom now going on, so the kind of decks that you were excited to see or excited to build and it just never made it because they weren't fast enough, let me know what those are. I would love some just to see your deck list, just so I have things to play. But otherwise, thanks so much for watching. Stay tuned. Ciao.